Good morning, everyone. I love this. I have to stop this great conversation. I'm so sorry, but good morning, and I'm so glad to see so many people. I'm Sue Brosser, and I'm the Senior Director for Center for Adult Learning, which includes your OLLIs, and we're so happy that everyone came. We're very close today, which is great, but we didn't receive a lot of RSVPs for the meeting, so that's why we kind of shifted rooms. So it's great, and we all have so much energy in the room, and it's wonderful. And just next time, if you folks didn't RSVP and you think you might come, go ahead and RSVP to us, so we'll make sure and have extra chairs and stuff. But we found more chairs, and everybody's comfortable, and it's wonderful to see so many people. So this is kicking off our 24th year of OLLI today. Woo! We're so excited. I think that to see where we were and to where we are today and some of the hurdles that we've gone through with the pandemic and all such, it's pretty incredible to see what we've done and such. So I appreciate your support, and we continue to grow, and I continue to grow even more and more. We have some programs on the table, so if you folks have not registered for anything, or if you have not renewed your OLLI membership, please do so. It's super important. And that information is in there. Some of the classes are already filled. Day classes are close to being filled if they're not already filled. So the excitement is out there, and I appreciate everyone's support, and I think it's fantastic. The membership right now is close to 800, and so we had a little bit different dates in regards to registration and such this year, so it's a little difficult to compare where we were last year and the year before, but we're keeping our pace, so that's fantastic. One thing that you'll see, and I always give you an assignment every single month, and the assignment is to grab a friend or someone you know, it doesn't have to be a friend, and tell them about OLLI and have them join. And so we were able to receive some special funding, and so you folks will see your OLLI on a billboard in Saginaw Township. It's going to start on September 15th, and it'll go for 2 weeks by Sam's Club. So it'll generate a lot of discussion, a lot of information, and then also make sure to tell our story and get the word out. And so if you see it, that's where it's all at, and we're really excited about that. So that should help the membership drive as well. We also have something special. We have some of our OLLI friends traveling in the Canadian Maritimes. We have 2 trips. One's out there now, and then one is starting on Monday. I'm going to be leading that group. And they wanted to make sure to be able to be live streamed into today's meeting. So we generally don't do that, and there's a lot of reasons for it. The biggest thing is, what kind of energy would you get in your living room versus this, right? So that's why we really think it's important to be face-to-face for monthly meetings. But we think it was really special for them to join us in the morning, and they had some free time on their agenda. So everybody wave to the Canadian Maritime folks. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the registration I said was well underway. Fall of 2024 classes, the day trips and multiple day trips. There are some rooms in, I have to get the glasses on. There are some rooms available, some space in some of the classes. The new member orientation is going to be next Monday, or this Monday coming up on the 16th from 12 to 1. Travel orientation is on Monday, September 16th from 1:30 to 2:30. And if any of you are going on the Canadian Maritimes trip with me, you could attend, but you better be a quick learner because we're going to leave an hour later. So just to let you know. The gluten-free cooking is September 20th. The aging journey, understanding brain changes and the dementia, what is dementia, on September 9th. That's already happened, but we're going to repeat that class. It seemed to be really popular. Mindfulness meditation is September 17th. And Family History for Beginners is on September 18th. So that's fantastic news. I want to update you on what's happening at your university. So SDSU is under the 3rd year of our new president, President Grant, and many of you met him. And so things are going wonderful. Lots of new individuals, senior administration, there's a lot of new VPs and such like that. But we are well underway with strategic planning. And I'm leading one of the groups, and the group is community. So it makes sense, right? But I have to say that I was so happy to see our Board of Control at SVSU to mention OLLI continuously through their notes. And they understand how important this organization is to SVSU, but more importantly, to the community. So it's great to have that reassurance and that reinforcement of how important they think it is too. So it's well underway. We're meeting this Friday with a core group of university personnel. So I'll update you throughout, but I think it's a new day out at SVSU, and we're looking at a 5-year plan and lots of things to cover and lots of things to do, so that's fantastic. I also have been involved with the provost search. As you remember, Deb Huntley is retiring January 3rd, and she's been a fantastic supporter of OLLI and the university for over 20 years. We'll make sure and have Deb at one of the meetings because I know we would want to personally thank her for the support, especially during the pandemic, everything that she did for us. So we're in the process of finding her replacement. So I'm learning a lot. Oh my goodness. But it's really great, and I'm very confident we'll have a fantastic replacement. And it's looking to be the winter semester that that person would come. So lots of good things there. So much to cover. I'm trying to do it fast so we get to the presentation itself. When we were talking about planning for monthly meetings, and we plan about 5 months in advance, if not sooner or even further out, we didn't want to do a big kickoff of the year and such like that, given that it's 9/11. And it's a significant day in our history. It's 23 years ago today, 2,977 people died. Changed the world forever, and every one of us remembers where we were at. I was at the university. I live here, but yes. But nonetheless, I think that it's important to, on Patriots Day, to acknowledge and really get the perspective and the historical perspective on what happened that day. And we're very blessed that Jason is joining us and going to present to us. I think that it's more appropriate to look at 9/11 in the historical perspective and one that we never forget what happened on this day. I actually have a pin, and Joe, you might remember this, Joe Brownlee. Good morning. Shortly after, I think it was like a couple days after, she handed out these pins, and I've worn it every day on 9/11 since then. It's a very impactful day, and I think that it changed our life forever. Quite honestly, I thought that was going to be the biggest tragedy in my lifetime. Unfortunately, we had the pandemic too, but nonetheless, I think that it's time to pause, to be grateful, to hug all your loved ones around you, and to listen to a fantastic presentation as well. So on that note, let me turn it over to Chris, and she'll do a bio. Thank you.
Good morning. And yes, I remember I was teaching when 9/11 happened, and it was really something. It is my pleasure to introduce Jason. Jason Szilagyi is a professor of history teaching at Delta College, Central Michigan University, and Northwood University. His major course of study is the modern Middle East, the formation of the modern state of Israel, and the history of the Holocaust. He is the Islamic and Middle Eastern advisor for Central Michigan University from 2018. Jason and his wife, Christina, teach many history courses for Saginaw Valley's OLLI program. And I have taken most of Jason and Chrissy's classes, and they are fantastic. And there are a whole group of us that take these classes and really enjoy it. I've been lobbying for him to start teaching some more classes because now when I look at him, I've taken almost all of them already. So he promised he'll come up with some new classes for us, but they do a phenomenal job with their classes. So with great honor and pleasure, I introduce Jason.
Hello. Good morning. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd and new faces who I hope you'll take some of our classes in the near future. I remember exactly where I was September 11th, 2001. Just to kind of give a little, retrospective, personal reflection with it. I worked at Barnes & Noble, the bookstore in Saginaw. And on that morning, I and another colleague had to go to the bank to actually drop off our deposit, pick up our change orders. And I remember sitting in the car and we had the radio on. And there's kind of this little news flash that popped in that said something was happening in New York, but not giving much context because nobody knew what was happening at the time. By the time we got back to the store, another one of our colleagues who was still at home called us, told us to, go to the break room, turn on the TV because something huge is taking place. We managed to make it back in time to actually see the second plane hit live. And at that moment, realizing that this is not a mistake, this is an attack, and that there's probably going to be more taking place throughout the day. We would normally, again, it's these kind of weird little things that kind of stick in your head. Normally, we would get the New York Times before the store even opened, and that was it for the day. We ended up getting 5 updated editions from 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, where we just kept constantly getting new ones and always getting new information. Hearing that the Pentagon had been hit. And so it was a day where I was looking at it as nothing is going to be the same again. My brother had just gotten married. My sister was about to get married. And I kept thinking to myself that this sense of security that I had grown up with, the whole world that, we're kind of untouchable, was gone. And that my niece and nephews would grow up in a world that was infinitely different than the one that I had. And so what I kind of want to talk about today is what is leading up to 9/11. Okay, so talking about from about 1993, really, to the day of the attack. Okay, and the fact that this is a long process, that this shadow was looming, that multiple administrations were warned about, but didn't really act on. Okay. So we can all, remember that day. I mean, when you're looking at the pictures from before the attack takes place, it was an idyllic September day. Blue sky, bright sunshine, just the ideal version of what we'd want for a fall day. And then within the matter of a couple hours, it became a nightmare. Not just in New York, but everywhere, because there was the uncertainty of what is going to happen next. So if we're looking at New York, at 8 a.m. on September 11, 2001, this is the view we would have had. This is the view at around 9:30, and just how everything had changed. Even the skyline, the smoke coming through. Again, it's one of those instances you never forget just the change that ended up taking place. And the World Trade Centers were a huge cultural icon in New York. They were, for a while, they were the largest buildings in the world, the largest buildings in New York. I always try to throw pop culture references into my class, so I'll throw a few in here. If you're looking at the King Kong movie in the 1970s, King Kong climbs the World Trade Centers. Okay. The attacks on the World Trade Centers actually changed the production of several movies. Okay, Spider-Man, the original one with Tobey Maguire, there was supposed to be a scene where he is weaving a web between the Twin Towers, and they had to go into post-production and cut that entire sequence out. Men in Black was another one where the Twin Towers were one of them was supposed to be a spaceship, and that got cut out in post-production. So it's kind of, I remember another thing too from Barnes & Noble. There were books that we had to pull from the shelves. That morning, there was one where it was a kid's book, where it was a Statue of Liberty an illustration of the Statue of Liberty with being tied up and that the city was being held hostage. We had to pull that book immediately off the shelf. And so it's just the ripple effect of what happened that day. It really did change how everything functioned. And again, with the trade centers, they were an icon of American economic power and world power. You had so many different offices that were located there, so many different businesses and business meetings and conferences that would go there, not to mention thousands and thousands of tourists per day who would go. And with this picture, this is actually the restaurant that was at the top of the World Trade Center, windows on the world. So you're kind of overlooking the city. Again, it was an instance, this was not just a place that the people who would work there would eat. This was a tourist spot. If you were in New York, you would go to the trade centers because you'd want to visit, not only the stores are at the bottom of it, but you'd want to go to the roof, to the observatory, to see the city as you go through. And if you could, you would eat there. Each of these buildings was 110 stories tall. And it's not just the Twin Towers that were part of this complex. There were multiple other buildings that were built around it in order to house other offices, other businesses. You're looking at nearly 10 million square feet. Each of those floors was almost covering an acre. Okay, in terms of, how much space you had in there. Roughly, you'd have about 35,000 people working there every day. You'd have about 430 companies, and then you'd have anywhere between 15 and 20,000 people a day coming in just to visit. Again, the shops that were there, the restaurants that were there to go through. Each tower weighed more than 250,000 metric tons. So these were substantial buildings, and the construction of them at the time was, to a degree, kind of unprecedented. We didn't really see that type of engineering going into New York like we had before. If you're looking at the 1920s and 1930s, a skyscraper, the race to build the giant ones, most of that was done by the 1930s. And with the World Trade Centers, when they come up, I remember there were some people who were saying they were kind of square, blocky buildings that were missing the Gothic, beauty of the 20s and 30s. You had 99 different elevators for each one. And not all of them ran from the bottom floor or the basement to the top. You had to basically go in, different, I would say, galleries. You could go up to certain floors in a certain elevator, get out, and then you have to go to the next elevator bank to be able to go further and further up. You had an underground parking structure. Again, with New York, there's not a lot of room, but if you're working the trade centers, you generally don't walk. You're going to drive, for the most part. You have 21,800 windows for these. The way that the trade centers have been designed was that you had a strong core, and that's where the elevators and most of your staircases were going to be located. And the outside was a facade of steel and concrete. And the towers were actually designed to be able to survive an impact of a 707, okay, a large plane. What had not been taken into account in the design was a fully loaded plane with all of its fuel. Okay, and the way that the structure was set up, because of where the elevators and the staircases were located, is that if you had something happen at certain floors, anyone above that area could not get out. There was no means of really rescuing anyone above a certain level if you couldn't get to those elevators or stairs. There's no fire trucks with ladders that are that tall. Helicopters cannot take that many people off at a time. And so, but there's the feeling that if something happened like that, a plane crashing into it, would be an accident. In the 1940s, planes hit, the Empire State Building, and it survived. Okay, and the idea is that when the World Trade Centers are being constructed, that same feeling would be put in there. Something that large, something could go wrong in a flight. Okay, and again, in terms of your materials, if you kind of laid out all the concrete from each of these buildings, you could go from New York to Washington, D.C. with a 5-foot wide sidewalk. And this is a tremendous amount of material and time that was put into these buildings. Now, September 11th, 2001 is the day that the towers fell. But this is not the first time that these were attacked. And not the first time they were attacked by Al Qaeda. On February 26, 1993, you have 7 men who are affiliated with the terrorist group that is called Al Qaeda, roughly translated as the base. Okay, that ended up parking a van that was filled with explosives in the underground parking deck and detonating it. Ultimately, 6 people were killed immediately, the 6 kind of security guards that were in the parking deck. And then you had thousands more that were injured. And I remember when that day happened too, because there were reporters outside, and you could see people coming out live, and there's smoke pouring out of the main floor of the World Trade Center. And people coming out in shock, covered in dust. And it was an instance, again, where this was something that had been planned out for months in advance. Now, what ended up happening was these 7 men came to the United States. They ended up renting this van, getting the explosives to it. They scouted out, the World Trade Center in order to kind of figure out the location of where they needed to park the vehicle in order to cause the most damage. The idea was that the tower that they bombed, what they were hoping for was that it would collapse into the other building and collapse both of them. And this was, while it sounds like an unsophisticated attack, the men who were involved in this were very aware of structural engineering. So when they're going through and they're scouting out where they're going to do this, they know, or at least they hope they're putting it in a spot where this one bomb is going to do maximum damage. Now, what ended up happening was that on March 4th, you had the first of these men, Mohammed Salama, being arrested. And it's this comedy of errors, what happens with him, why he got caught. He went back to the Van Randel agency to try to get back his $400 deposit. And of course, when that, you have the FBI, you have the NSA, you have all of these different law enforcement agencies that have been combing over, those parking decks in that building and finding some fragments to the vehicle. They know it was a van. This guy goes back to pick up the deposit. Well, where's the van? I don't know. And what ends up happening is he's arrested. He's interrogated by the FBI. Shortly thereafter, 3 more of the conspirators are arrested. Now, the mastermind behind it, the one who came up with the plan, who recruited the members who were going to do this, and then escaped, is the man on the upper left-hand corner, Ramzi Youssef. He is not captured until February 1995, so 2 years after the attack. And he's captured in Pakistan. He had managed to escape the United States and get into Pakistan and go back into hiding in that area, and then eventually he is caught. The 7th plotter, Abdul Yassin, he's still at large. Never found him. He's disappeared into the woodworks, and he is one of the most wanted on the FBI's list. The other 6, they are basically sitting in prison. They all receive life sentences. But this is the first, to a degree, the first of Al-Qaeda's attacks on American soil. And there was this loose understanding that there is this organization that is operating in the Middle East and in North Africa. We're not entirely certain how the FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, they're not entirely certain how big this group is, what their ultimate goals are. They just know that they're recruiting and they're planning different attacks. But there's no concrete information as to what is going on. There is a link, though. Okay, and I'm sorry, I take my classes back in time a little bit further back than what we talk about as we go through, but to give kind of context to where Al-Qaeda comes from, we have to look back into Afghanistan in the late 1970s. Okay, because Afghanistan up until 1973 had been a monarchy. It was pretty much unaligned. It was not aligned with the Soviet Union. It was not aligned with the United States. It was kind of a third world country operating relatively independent. But what ends up happening in 1973 is you have a military coup that takes place. And they end up deposing, okay, Mohammad Zahir Shah, the king of Afghanistan, the last king of Afghanistan. He ends up fleeing to Pakistan in exile. And he's hoping that either the United States or Britain will help put him back into power. He's going to die in exile, decades after, with no outside power trying to put him back in. The Republic of Afghanistan is the new country, the new government. It's made up of a combination of democratic groups and military officers and also some religious leaders. That only lasts 5 years before there's another coup in 1978. And in this case, it is a communist coup, which the Soviet Union is happy for. Because if they have Afghanistan as an ally in Central Asia, that helps reinforce, okay, kind of Soviet power in the region. What ends up happening with that is that a lot of the local leaders inside Afghanistan, whether they're just purely tribal leaders who are, secular leaders, chieftains of different areas that control different areas, or religious leaders, they do not want a communist government. And so what ends up happening is you have most of the countryside erupt into revolution against this new communist government. And in 1979, the Soviet Union rushes thousands of soldiers in to support the Afghan communists. And this is going to be a 10-year-long war, the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989. This is going to be one of the things that causes the Soviet Union to collapse in 1991, the cost of this war, in terms of how much money and material and men they sink into this, and ultimately the Afghan communists are overthrown themselves. These are pictures of Soviet troops crossing from the Soviet border into Afghanistan. They're going in, and what will end up happening is that the Soviets are able to control the cities, but they cannot control the countryside. This is very similar to what happens to the United States and our allies in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, the Soviet Union and China provided North Vietnam with weapons and training. The United States is going to do that for the Afghan rebels, because this is our payback for Vietnam. It's not just the local population that's going to fight against the Soviets. You're going to have thousands of Muslim volunteers from the Middle East and from North Africa going to Afghanistan to join what are called the Mujahideen, okay, the kind of religious fighters that the Afghans have set up. And this is not a conventional war. Okay, it's not like World War II. This is guerrilla warfare. The Mujahideen fight in the mountains, they fight in valleys, and they withdraw. They will not stand up and fight the Soviets in a conventional manner. And that's going to hurt the Soviets because they're not used to that. Okay, what will end up happening is the United States and Great Britain look at these Afghan rebels as the enemies of my enemy are my friend. A lot of these Afghan groups are not friendly to the West. They had not had anything to do with the United States and Britain before that. But it's the idea that this is a way that we can grind the Soviet Union down and hurt them. The man that you're seeing at the top, okay, this is U.S. Senator okay, Charlie Wilson. You might have seen the book Charlie Wilson's War and the movie. He is the politician who pushes the Reagan administration to support the Afghan Mujahideen without really having a plan of, okay, we support them. What happens afterwards? Are they still going to be our allies when the Soviets are out of there, or are we just using them as an expedient? Okay. What the United States will end up doing is we end up providing money, military training, and weapons. Okay, some very modern weapons. Okay, one of the things that the Soviets do to help control the countryside is they use helicopter patrols to basically go from village to village to make sure that there's not Mujahideen fighters there. If they are, the helicopters attack that village. Not only the fighters, but the civilians that are there. And the Soviets believe that that is going to break the morale of the Afghans. Instead, it causes more of them to fight. The tactics that the Mujahideen learn, how to take down these armored helicopters, they're going to train Somali insurgents in the 1990s how to do that to the United States and United Nations forces that are operating there. Now, this is in 1983. These are different Afghan leaders. Some of them are Mujahideen leaders. Okay, so they're actually commanders of these different militia groups or insurgent groups. Some of them are religious leaders. Some of them are political, strictly political. And they're in the Oval Office talking to President Reagan and Cambridge professor, Professor Berry, who at the time taught at Cambridge. He was an Islamic history specialist. He had actually been to Afghanistan before all these revolutions had taken place. He knew a lot of the political and religious leaders who were in there. He also worked with Doctors Without Borders. He was a humanitarian. What he was trying to do was to get the United States government to send humanitarian aid. Okay. Food, medicine, clothing, doctors to go in and basically help the regular Afghans who were struggling at this point. And the United States, to a degree, kind of writes a blank check. And whatever they are going to need, we will work with them. Now, one of the fundamentalist groups, okay, one of the religious extremist groups that is going to be operating alongside the Mujahideen, okay, is from Saudi Arabia, okay, and the person who founds it is Osama bin Laden. Okay, he is going to take a core group of Saudis with him to fight against the Soviets, to basically push them out of Afghanistan. And in his view, it's not a political battle. He's not fighting to push the communist government out so that there can be a democratic government put in. He's fighting in Afghanistan because he wants an Islamic government in there. He wants a caliphate, basically, where religious and secular political power are tied together. Okay. And he ends up putting together his group, which is Al-Qaeda, the base. And the idea behind this is, with Al-Qaeda, it does not necessarily have a home territory. It can move anywhere in the world, and it can have branches anywhere in the world. And the idea behind it is that a single strike against it cannot wipe out its whole leadership. You could kill some of them, but not all of them, okay, as they go through. And bin Laden is very successful. Okay, he is able to recruit many more foreign fighters than others. He's not just pulling in Saudis, he's pulling in people from Lebanon and from Syria and Yemen. No Iraqis, no Iranians, because they are ideological enemies of him. Now, when the Afghan war ends, the Soviets are pushed out and the Afghan communist government has fallen. There is no singular government in Afghanistan. Instead, it's all of these different Afghan groups that are fighting against each other in order to see which one is going to be the dominant power. Eventually, when the war ends in 1989, Al-Qaeda is forced out of Afghanistan. because they're viewed as too extreme. And what ends up happening is they bounce into Yemen, and then they go into Somalia. The Afghan civil war eventually is won by the Taliban, another fundamentalist group. But these are strictly Afghans. Even though they win the civil war, they control the south and center of Afghanistan. The northern part of the country is controlled by what's called the Northern Alliance. These are Afghan groups that are still friendly to the United States and to Great Britain. And so you have this Afghan civil war going from about 1990 to about 1993. And once the Soviets are gone, most of the support that the West was giving all of these different fighters that had been going against the Soviets, that dries up, and there's no interest in actually helping form a functional government. Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires because many different powerful nations throughout history have tried to go in there and conquer it. The only ones who ever did were the Mongols. And that's because they decimated the population. Now, what will end up happening is that now that the Soviets are gone, Al-Qaeda doesn't just disappear. Osama bin Laden is looking for another enemy. And the United States is going to be that enemy. He'll take our money, he'll take our weapons, he'll take our training, but it's opportunistic. It's for his own ends. Now, what brings Al-Qaeda in the United States into direct conflict is actually the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. Okay, Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. Okay, in August 1990, really July 1990, you had Iraq invade Kuwait and occupy it. To counter that, the United States, Great Britain, France, many of the other Western European countries that were in NATO, along with a lot of North African and Middle Eastern countries, ended up sending forces into Saudi Arabia in order to prevent Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army from continuing into Saudi Arabia. And there's this buildup of forces from August 1990 to January 1991. Okay, that's the Operation Shield. That's to keep Saddam out and warn him, saying basically, get out of Kuwait, evacuate, and you'll face international condemnation and punishment, but there might not have to be a war involved in this. When Saddam lets the ultimatum expire, that's when Operation Storm, the expulsion of Iraq out of Kuwait, takes place. And that's a really fast campaign. It's from January 17th to February 28th, 1991. Most of that time are actually airstrikes, allied or coalition airstrikes against Iraqi targets in Kuwait and in the southern part of Iraq. The ground war in the first Gulf War is only 100 hours. It only takes roughly over 4 days to expel what's left of the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. Okay. Now, what ends up happening is that Saddam Hussein is not removed from power with the first Gulf War. Instead, what is going to end up happening is that there are no-fly zones that are put in southern Iraq and northern Iraq. The U.S. has to keep forces in Saudi Arabia in order to have planes to enforce that and soldiers to enforce the ceasefire. For Muslims, Saudi Arabia is holy ground because you have Mecca and Medina, two of the three most holy cities in Islam located in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden looks at these U.S. forces sitting in Saudi Arabia as an occupation force instead of as a force for protection. So he is going to use discontent among the Saudis and among other peoples in the Middle East of this U.S. presence there to recruit more and more people. The United States and the coalition are kind of flush with victory after this first Gulf War. You had this massive multi-nation, multicultural, ethnic, religious coalition go in and stop further, Iraqi occupation of the Middle East. And there is a humanitarian crisis that is taking place in Somalia. It's another country, okay, this one in the east, on the east coast of Africa, that is in the middle of a famine and a civil war. And the United Nations, spearheaded by the United States, Great Britain, France, even Saudi Arabia, decide to send in forces in order to bring in humanitarian aid so that these Somali people do not starve while these warlords fight. And these UN forces are also there to try to keep these Somali warlords from killing each other, or well, really killing civilians. This is called Operation Restore Hope. So you have US troops that are sitting in Saudi Arabia. You're going to have more that end up going to Yemen, which is just to the southwest of Saudi Arabia. This is where Al-Qaeda strikes first. On December 29th, 1992, you have another car bomb that Al-Qaeda, well, really their first car bomb that they're going to use, that detonates outside the Gold Mahor Hotel in Aden, which is the capital of Yemen. This hotel was housing US Marines as they were waiting to shift from the Arabian Peninsula to Somalia, across the Red Sea. And in this case, they kill a few dozen, they injure a couple hundred more, and again, this is the first time that Al-Qaeda has hit US targets. And so the FBI, the NSA start going through and trying to figure out who are the actors in this. After the bombing in Yemen, you have US and UN forces operating in Somalia. Okay, the context for this, the book and the movie Black Hawk Down. Okay, where you have US Rangers and Delta Force trying to capture Somali warlords and having helicopters shot down over the city of Mogadishu. The Somali militants learned how to take down helicopters from Al-Qaeda militants that were in Somalia. Bin Laden and most of his command group and a lot of his militants were in Somalia training Somali soldiers, because the Somali soldiers were Muslim as well. Okay? And most of the UN forces operating in Somalia were Christian. You did have a Saudi and a Pakistani contingent, but they were the smallest groups in there. And what will end up happening is there is a raid that the United States decides to conduct to capture a group of warlords and their lieutenants in the middle of Mogadishu in the middle of the day. There had been other operations like this, but they have been done at night. And what ends up happening is that when these helicopters and the ground forces for the UN come in, the meeting where these Somali warlords is taking place is in the biggest weapons market in Africa. And what ends up happening is these Somali militants, once they find out that this US force has landed, they raid that weapons market for every weapon they can get their hands on. And this turns into one of the biggest firefights and longest firefights that the United States military had up to that point since Vietnam. Okay. And then you have Al-Qaeda striking again, this time by themselves, in Saudi Arabia. On November 13th, 1995, another car bomb is detonated near a building that's called the Office of the Program Manager, Saudi Arabian National Guard Modernization Program. Okay, this is a military installation where you have U.S. Military officers and soldiers who are training Saudi National Guardsmen in modern warfare. Okay, again, you have the U.S. presence there. Saudi Arabia is where most of the United States and coalition forces are to contain Saddam Hussein. And what ends up happening in this case is this car bomb goes off and it destroys the front of the building. Okay, again, it ends up killing about 26 people, injures about 244 more. And in this case, you have not only United States personnel who are killed, but also Saudi personnel who are killed. Saudi Arabia and the United States have a strained relationship, then and now. Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, the royal family, has a very strained relationship with power, because how they came to power was using religious militants to basically knock out other Arabic tribes who were in competition for control of the country. And then when they weren't useful, the House of Saud destroyed them. But that Islamic fundamentalist core of how Saudi Arabia was created, that sticks around. And that is still a shadow today. So now we're in 1995. We've had a couple bombings taking place. We've had information that, Al-Qaeda is operating in Somalia, but we don't actually know where they're at. We've had opportunities to kill, assassinate, whatever you want to call it, eliminate some of the leadership of Al-Qaeda. The problem is there are neutral parties that are usually with them. So there would be collateral damage if we did a cruise missile strike or we did a helicopter attack. And then we'd have to deal with the political fallout of that. Now the next major attack, and this one is enormous. This one is August 7th, 1998. This is 2 different American embassies in East Africa that are going to be simultaneously attacked with car bombs again. And in this case, the one is in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and the other is taking place in Kenya, in Nairobi. These car bombings, the damage is catastrophic. I mean, not that these attacks are not catastrophic in any different way, shape, or form, but these are much more destructive and are much more lethal. Between these 2 bombings, 224 people are killed immediately. 5,000 others are injured. And this is when the United States realizes just how dangerous this organization is, and there need to be steps in order to track them and try to figure out how to stop them. Okay, so you have the origins of Al-Qaeda coming from the Reagan administration, growing in the first Bush administration, continuing to grow in the Clinton administration, and it's going to come to fruition in the second Bush administration. This is not ground zero in New York. This is Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. These are the 2 East African embassies that are destroyed. But that image of rescue workers crawling across, these huge slabs of concrete, digging desperately to try to find anyone who's still left alive, is searing. It's stuck in this. Now, the last major attack that happens from Al-Qaeda before September 11th is going to be in October of 2000. This one, again, is going to take place in Yemen, in Aden's harbor, so the capital city of Yemen. And Yemen is descending into a civil war itself by this point in time. The Cole is a U.S. destroyer. Relatively modern. Actually, it is modern. It's one of the newest ships in the U.S. Navy. She's sitting in the harbor to be refueled before she goes back on patrol in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. While she's sitting in harbor, a rubber dinghy moves up alongside the ship and explodes by the waterline. You have 17 sailors who are killed immediately and 37 others who are injured. The damage to the Cole is not enough to sink her outright, but it is devastating enough that the ship actually has to sit in harbor until a Norwegian recovery vessel, a ship that is designed to basically kind of semi-submerge, go underneath the ship that it's going to carry, and then pick it up. Can carry it from Yemen to the United States to be repaired. Before the Cole was attacked, there was going to be another attack on another U.S. destroyer, the USS Sullivans, named after the Sullivan brothers who died in the Pacific in World War II. That attack could not be successfully conducted because the boat that was going to attack it was too heavy and couldn't get to it in time. So by 2000, there is a paper trail of attacks and information on Al-Qaeda about what is happening. And there are CIA agents, national security agents, FBI agents, who are alerted that this organization exists and that is continuing to strike U.S. targets. Mostly it had been military targets until those embassies were attacked. And then it becomes civilian targets. And then there's the question of what do we do? Okay, Al-Qaeda has left North Africa, has left Saudi Arabia. It has been invited back to Afghanistan by the Taliban. And with the Taliban, they allowed Al-Qaeda to open up recruitment camps and training camps in order to expand the numbers. Once the Taliban actually gets wind of what bin Laden wants to do, the attacks on the trade centers, the Taliban want him out again because he is too extreme. They're trying to set their government up as a legitimate government, and bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would destabilize that in world relations. But they don't kick him out until after September 11th. And they try to officially kick him out, but they still stay behind. Now, all through the summer of 2001, there are reports coming into the FBI and the CIA and the NSA and other security agencies in the United States and outside the United States that there are members of Al-Qaeda who have gotten in to the country and that something is taking place. There is some sort of plan that they're coming up with, but nobody quite knows what it is. On August 6, 2001, in the briefing of the day, the daily briefing, every president gets one of these every morning it's an intelligence update for what is happening not only in the United States, but on the world stage, to give them an idea of these are things that could potentially happen today or in the near future. We should have contingency plans. You should know that this is going on. On Monday, August 6, 2001, George W. Bush is having this daily briefing. And one of his aides brings this to him, and he says, look, we know that there are a certain number of these operatives in different areas in the East Coast of the United States. Whatever is going to happen, it's going to involve aviation, because we're getting reports from these private airfields where they're training people how to operate multi-engine planes. Takeoff and flight, not landing. That's a huge indicator that something is not right here. And the thing is, those pilots who are going to be the ones who are flying those hijacked planes, these are not civilians. These have been former members of the Saudi Air Force. They had been trained by the United States to operate jet fighters, but not commercial airliners. So these are people who already know how to fly. It's just they need to know how to fly those commercial planes so they could do the most damage. And again, with the groups that are going to be involved in this, they have been scouting out their targets for weeks. Okay, bin Laden and his family, they are Saudi construction magnates. They're architects. So they know what it takes to put up a skyscraper and how to take down a skyscraper. Okay? And what is going to happen is when this briefing is given, President Bush basically tells the one who's giving it to him, his nickname was Brownie. He says, Brownie, you covered your own ass by giving this, but there's nothing we could really do with it. And so 36 days before the attack takes place, the government knows something is going to happen. They just don't know what. And they don't know where. Okay. That first attack in 1993 was also supposed to be multi-target. It wasn't just the trade center that they were going to hit. They were going to have car bombs in the tunnels, okay, leading out of New York to New Jersey or to Manhattan. They were going to hit tourist sites that were there. It's just they didn't have enough time to get all that material together. Okay. And again, with this intelligence warning, it says the patterns of suspicious activity in this country are consistent with preparations for hijacking. Hijackings of airplanes were nothing new. They had taken place in the Middle East and in Europe and North Africa from the 1970s onwards. But generally, when there were hijackings in those periods, it was to use the passengers as prisoners and currency, basically to trade what they wanted. With these attacks, they are going to be victims. They're going to be shields because the attackers are hoping that the United States military does not respond if we find out. You'll remember after the second plane hit, there started to be the calls for all flights in the United States to be shut down. And then when the Pentagon is hit, that goes into effect. And you had these massive passenger planes being forced to land at airfields that could not accommodate them because they were not capable of doing that. The last flight to come down was in Alaska, and it was a South Korean commercial plane. They received the warning that everybody had to be grounded, but they didn't have a good translator on board. So when they're flying into U.S. airspace in Alaska, there are military fighter jets that escort them to a military base. If they would not have landed, they would have shot that plane down. But by then, the damage was done. But there was the three, you have both trade centers hit, both towers hit. You have the Pentagon being hit. And then you have Flight 93 crashing in Pennsylvania. And there's the uncertainty of, have we got all of the planes on the ground? And then is it not just going to be attack via air? Are we going to be seeing attacks on subways or car bombings again? Again, when that day was happening, and I was watching, just like you, watching it happen live, the world flipped on its head. And I remember we actually closed the store early, which we would never do except in bad weather. And got home and then waited until 6 o'clock when President Bush was going to give us his briefing. And there was the fear of what is going on and what is going to continue. September 11, 2001 still casts a huge shadow on everything. Nothing was the same after this. The trust in allies that we had has faded. This document was declassified in 2005. This is actually to a degree, there's some redacted information that's thrown on there. But this is the briefing that President Bush got August 6th. But that did not come out for 4 years afterwards. There is a book that I would recommend, again, as a former bookseller and as a teacher, a history teacher. I can't get away from books. There's a really good book that's called The Looming Tower, which discusses the formation of Al-Qaeda in the late 1980s all the way through the attack. Okay, and again, it's the fact that the intelligence communities were catching wind that something was going to take place. You had this buildup of attacks. But there was kind of the hubris that we can't be touched on our home soil. And unfortunately, history has taught us that no country is immune. Yep, the book title is The Looming Tower. Should be, I know it's available electronically, and it should be available physically. I think SVSU probably could bring it in, but you'll all have to fight for a copy of it. But it is an excellent book on this. Okay. The author's name, okay, is Lawrence Wright, W-R-I-H-T. This winter, because we've hit the anniversary of 9/11, I am planning on doing a class on discussing, a couple classes, discussing Al-Qaeda, discussing the civil war in Afghanistan, giving some context to why this happened. This is, again, these events were not something that just spontaneously happened. There is a long history and trail for what is going to take place on September 11, 2001 to today. So that is the end of my presentation, and I was told that the most likely will be questions, so I'm available.
There's one right behind you, and then we'll get you next.
So if President Bush had taken this seriously, what might they have done? I mean, I know hindsight's 20/20,
Yeah,
but
the FBI could have been told to go actively out and then further investigate and potentially arrest, okay, the ones who are going to be the attackers. So there's the potential that security could have been heightened. There could have been warnings, okay, to the airline agencies that, you need to provide extra security as you go through. So there's the sad part is that in many cases it's very hard to stop things like this from taking place. But if you are aware and you allow that awareness to trickle down to the agencies that are responsible for it or the areas that might be under threat, a lot of these men could have been arrested because a lot of them were being tracked ahead of this.
I was just wondering about the architectural structure. Did anything ever come out in terms of what could have been done different with the Twin Towers? Or why the way they collapsed?
The way that the towers have been designed, where they had the elevators and the stairwells in the interior, you didn't really have a lot of redundancy. So you had only a certain number of ways out of different floors to get further down. And when Al-Qaeda is coming up with the plan of where to attack, they're looking at hitting these buildings somewhere in the center, okay, the center floors, or the upper floors, because they want to trap as many people above so that they can't get out. And while the structural engineers went through the process saying, okay, the buildings can survive the impact of these planes hitting them, the fuel is the thing that you need to worry about. Because what ends up happening is most of the planes disintegrate when they hit the outside shell. But the engines, the landing gear, all of the heavy parts of the plane continue to move through like battering rams. And you have the fuel that's in the wings. The fuel spills out, and a lot of that actually went down the stairwells and the elevator shafts and then lit on fire. And, you hear the thing where it's like, jet fuel doesn't melt steel. Jet fuel just needs to weaken steel. Because where they were hit, yes, at the bottom, the steel is still relatively intact. There's fires that are burning there. But the fires on the floors, where those planes hit, that is structurally deforming that metal. And all of the weight of the floors above it is pressing down. And so once the metal loses its rigidity, there's nothing that's going to stop those floors from coming straight down. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
since the people people that were training the pilots that crashed into the plane, the buildings, reported them to the FBI or to the CIA. How come people weren't tracking these people, especially when they were leaving from Boston and everything? I never quite understood why they weren't being tracked since they were early on identified.
They were keeping tabs on them, but they were told kind of keep hands off. The sad part is like they're, again, the FBI, the police, they're all stumbling to try to figure out what is going on. They're not sure exactly when these attacks are going to take place. While they have agents that are, wiretapping these people, and they have some who are going to follow them through, there's no actual authorization to do anything to them. Again, it's just the idea of watch and wait. And the sad part is that when they're leaving to go to these planes, it's not like the airlines or the security officers at the airports know what's going on. For them, they're saying, and you don't have this strict of, the pat-downs and the metal detecting that we do now. That's in response to what ends up happening. And again, the way that these planes are hijacked is, to a degree, is very low tech because the weapons that they bring on board are box cutters. It's not guns, it's not regular knives, not that everybody cruises around with a box cutter in their pocket, but to a degree, it was looked at as these are not really weapons until somebody decides to turn them into that.
How come the people that were the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania were successful in making the plane crash rather than the other two planes?
What is going to happen with the other two planes is that they're taken first. The third plane is in the air, but they find out what has happened at the World Trade Center. Generally, what the aircrew are trained to do in terms of hijacking is it's to save the passengers. So you acquiesce. You kind of cave to the hijackers. But now that's not saying that the pilots and co-pilots and the engineering crew did not try to prevent that happening. There's actually a security door that can only be opened from inside the cockpit. But what ended up happening in those first two planes was that the attackers actually slit the throats of the stewardesses to force the pilots to open the doors, which they ended up doing. And again, with hijackings up to this point, for the most part, you have someone hijack the plane and they take you to a different location than when you're supposed to go. The idea with the hijackings, and again, in the 70s and 80s, is that you have the terrorists take the plane, they land it in North Africa or Cyprus or somewhere in the Middle East. The hostages sit there for several days while there's negotiations going back and forth. And a lot of the times, the terrorists are overtaken by local security forces. In this case, what ends up happening is these planes are taken over almost immediately after takeoff. And with the way that they're flying, again, these planes are not going across the Atlantic. These are continental flights where they're going from the East Coast to the West Coast. So when they're hijacked and they start flying out of the normal pattern in New York, there's the question of, the ground traffic controllers are like, well, what kind of is going on? Because they're not necessarily sure that these planes have been taken over. The first plane hit, and initially everyone thinks it's a mistake. And then 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later, you have the second plane hit. The one that goes down in Pennsylvania, that takes place almost an hour into the attacks. And there are phones on that plane. And the passengers who are on there are calling home to tell people what is happening. And then they find out. And they decide that, after they find out that the Pentagon has been hit, they're not going to be used.
How were they successful? I mean, I
There's
don't understand how.
There's a lot of controversy with that. There's the discussion that the passengers on Flight 93, yes, they do say that they're going to try to storm the cockpit. We'll never know whether they actually successfully did that or not. The plane what we know is that it went into a really shallow dive and it exploded in the field. By that point, that's when there's the grounding. Any plane that's not responding to being grounded, the United States military is scrambling fighter jets.
Did we have any fighter planes that were near the plane in Pennsylvania?
Not necessarily within visual range, but we have missiles that can shoot down planes 30 miles out. We have other missiles that can hit planes 89 miles out. So there's this, again, without knowing for sure and without having those units that were nearby give their records unredacted, we don't know whether Flight 93 crashed under its own power or whether it's shot down. If you're looking at it from kind of I hate putting it this way because it sounds callous. If you're looking at it from a propaganda standpoint, Flight 93 fought back. Where the other three planes, the people could not or did not. And so there's kind of this feeling that this is the last plane, and they decided to, again, not be shields and not be victims in it. They took agency with it. But again, there's the question of whether they did that themselves or whether we shot them down. Because after the Pentagon is hit, there are fighter jets over New York and Norfolk and Washington and New York. The U.S. military is starting to scramble to make sure that no more planes are taken over. And the horrifying part is that if you were that pilot, that fighter pilot that did that, you you stopped an attack, but at the same time, you have all of those people's blood on your hands.
One more question, or two more questions.
Two more questions.
Okay.
What has been done since 2001 to increase the security of this country? Have we learned anything from this event?
Yeah, I was going to say yes and no. There have been improvements. You have the FBI, the NSA, the CIA. Before, they all kind of operated in their own wheelhouses. Okay, the FBI investigates in country, in the United States. NSA operates kind of all over the world. CIA operates all over the world. But for the most part, a lot of their investigations before 2001 were independent. And a lot of times the departments did not share information back and forth. Now that's been a lot more streamlined. You have the Department of Homeland Security, which is a new agency that is massive, that is supposed to be overseeing what is going on inside the United States, in the major cities, along the borders, in the ports. You have a much more robust kind of tracking for different terrorist groups now. You have watch lists not only for external, but internal terrorists that go in there. But a lot of times, it still revolves around what your administrations and how your intelligence agencies are going to be able to operate. And a lot of times the strikes for foreign threats are going to have to take place outside the United States. And you have to have good relations with the countries that those strikes are being conducted in. So you have to be connected to their military, to their government, so that if we do conduct raids or missile strikes inside their territory, they're not going to take that as a hostile act against them. One of the sad parts is that after September 11th, we're getting close. I will make this quick. I'm sorry, I like to talk. One of the major allies when we go into Afghanistan is Pakistan, which is a military dictatorship. They take tens of billions of dollars from us, okay, in order to allow land transportation of our equipment, our fuel, our people to go from Pakistan into Afghanistan, which is a landlocked country. The problem with that is that Pakistan was housing Osama bin Laden in a neighborhood where most of their military generals, their top generals, lived. And they were passing information on. Oops. to the Taliban and to other agencies. So we've learned some things, and we still play with others. We still haven't quite gotten it right.
Last question.
Last one.
Okay, this is back on your last topic. Wasn't it right after the attack, or we kind of led to believe that the Flight 93 was flying under the radar, and they weren't sure where that plane was, they just moved out there. So it's a question of being shot down unless they're doing it to save face of that poor pilot that might have to shoot them down. But isn't it, are we not correct in knowing, or them saying that they didn't know where the plane was, or is that just to say
We have radar that can pick up planes low to the ground. With our military jets, we have what's called look down, shoot down radar, where not only can we see the horizon, okay, and straight across, we have radar that can look down at the ground and pick up targets that are flying low.
Are we kind of, from listening to what you're saying way back in the early 90s, so are we kind of responsible or have hand in what happened in South because we trained them
Yes.
how to do it?
That's the more I study this, and like I said, I have studied the Middle East, studied Central Asia from the modern. The Cold War spills over into that area, and you have the United States has its proxies, the Soviet Union had their proxies, and while the United States and the Soviet Union did not fight directly, we fought against each other's little brothers, so to speak. And when we fought in Vietnam, the Soviet Union bloodied our nose in that one. Afghanistan was our opportunity to do that, and we did it. The United States government, again, it doesn't matter what administration, we do not have what's called realpolitik, real politics. Being able to look long range in the future and see what's coming down the line decades. We see what is going to be what we think, or what the government thinks, is a short-term answer to what we think is going to be a short-term problem. Without, again, we become allies with certain groups, and when they're not useful to us anymore, we do not do anything with them, and they fall by the wayside. Some of those people are not going to forget that. And in this case, it is, that enemy of my enemy is not my friend.
So doesn't that fall back into politics that's going on right now? Mm-hmm. That if we stop suddenly helping other countries,
the thing is that you can't pull away. Isolationism does not work. The thing is that there has to be, you have to actually have people who are advising the government who actually know what's happening on the ground. Because again, when it came to Charlie Wilson, that senator who pushes, the Reagan administration into supplying the Mujahideen, he knew nothing about that country. He knew nothing about the politics. But it was a way he could advance his own political career. Yeah. That's the sad part. A lot of people will go through the process of, it's my career that I'm putting first, and that's going to come back to hurt everybody.
Thank you so much, Jason. We appreciate.
Thank you.
We appreciate the partnership that Jason and his wife has had with OLLI, and we look forward to additional classes. So thank you very much for that.
I was going to say, Clayton, merchandising, advertising. Christine and I also have a podcast at Wall.
Oh, wonderful.
We do every 2 weeks, or twice a week actually, that we go through different historical and current events topics. So if you listen to podcasts, or if you read online, the QR code for you. So
Wonderful. I'll put these in the back by the travel table, so you can stop by and pick those up and make sure and get the QR code. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the support. I know it was a really heavy morning, but it was a really heavy day in history. So make sure you spread the history, spread your knowledge, talk to your children, talk to your family, talk to everyone, so we keep this information and the history behind it on a continuous basis. But on that note, everybody have a fantastic day. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next month.